G'day, mate. Luke Ford here. Want to talk about a classic work of religious psychology, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, a study in human nature by Harvard University psychologist and philosopher William James. Okay, let's start with Richard. Over to you. You have some thoughts.
Hey, Luke. First of all, thank you for asking me about this. It's funny, we were both reading this at the same time, and so I thought that was kind of interesting. I had never read William James, although my years in 12 step, I'd heard his name mentioned a bunch of times, and I'd never really followed up on that. And I said, well, it's about time to do that. So I did. And, you know, it, it's fascinating how his thought really permeates that. I'll get to more of that a little bit further on here, but uh, just a quick, what I found out about William James, I kind of investigated that and I found him pretty interesting. Um, he was born in Lower Manhattan at the Astor House Hotel. Now, his family was wealthy. He was named for his grandfather who immigrated to the U.S. from Ireland in 1789. Now, his grandfather, William James, also was successful in banking and real estate, and he amassed a fortune which today would be worth probably about 35 million. So he's very successful. So James really grew up in an environment of privilege. Um, he experienced the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railway, and the industrialization of America. So he was at a really pivotal time in American history. Now, his father, Henry James Sr., was an influential theologian. He graduated from Princeton. Um, Now, this is where it gets interesting for me. His godfather was Ralph Waldo Emerson, very well known, very important literary figure. And given that, it's not a surprise that William and his younger brother Henry James were probably introduced through him to a lot of people in the literary community. And that was during what's called the American Gilded Age. And he knew Mark Twain, who actually coined that phrase. So I found all those things really interesting. But just because of his position in history and how pivotal a time that is, and how much of the Enlightenment thought was taking root in American culture and kind of supplanting um, former Protestant ethic and practice and a lot of other things. So he kind of fit at a very interesting time. But my experience of the book was that he was trying to anchor that kind of cultural understanding in scientific reality. And he was trying to do it in a very uh, disciplined way. I thought it was interesting. Anyway, he attended Harvard. He was initially interested in the practice of medicine, but he realized that his interest lay elsewhere. The way he says it, and I like this, I originally studied medicine in order to be a physiologist, but I drifted into psychology and philosophy with a sort of fatality. I never had any philosophic instruction. The first lecture on psychology I ever heard being the first I ever gave. So he was really kind of, breaking ground, which I always find people like that very interesting. To kind of sum that up, I don't want to go too much into his biography. I'm sure lots of people have done great work on that. But I like what Alfred North Whitehead said. He's the British mathematician and philosopher. His comment on William James is Western literature had four great thinkers whose services to civilized thought rest largely on their achievements in philosophical assemblage. These men are Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, and William James. That's some pretty rarefied company.
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of funny. A recent survey of American psychologists ranked James as number 14 among his peers in the field. Made me wonder what they would say about Plato or Aristotle had they been practicing today. Anyway, but I want to kind of jump into the book, and I want to kind of follow the flow of the lectures because there's a really good logic to them, which I appreciate. just a little bit of background. The material for the book was taken from William James lectures that he delivered at the Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland in 1901 and 1902. He edited the material compiled from those lectures to comprise the book. Now, the purpose of the Gifford Lectures was established in 1885, and it was to create a forum to discuss natural theology. That's as a science that deals with the existence of God and divine purpose by observing nature and using reason. This book really exemplifies that extremely well. So he was very much in keeping with that. One important distinction is that natural theology considers religious thought and feelings in human beings apart from institutionalized religion. And that's really kind of the real structure of these lectures. And so that's one of the reasons that all the material he gets are people's experience. I mean, he brings in people from people like George Fox, St. Teresa, St. Augustine, Jonathan Edwards, Martin Luther, Leo Tolstoy, John Bunyan, and a lot of other really well-known religious leaders and thinkers. I think from James' standpoint, the extremes of that spectrum of religious experience, in order to highlight their nature, is why he chose these people. So he really kind of bring up the contrast of, what is this? But I think he also believed that most people, though they had these experiences, usually had them to a much lesser or milder degree. Okay. The first lecture, he really just kind of frames his whole conversation. It's about outlining the scope of religious experience. And in keeping with natural theology, makes it clear he's not critiquing organized religion. He's not taking that on. But he's examining the religious experience of individuals. He does address some of the ways in which people attempt to invalidate these kinds of religious experiences. He dismisses the notion that overactive nerves, bad digestion, lack of exercise, or even sexual dysfunction were the source of those experiences. That was very common thinking at that time. I think it's still pretty common. He calls this attempt medical materialism, and his attitude really is very much alive today. James does concede that not a single one of our states of mind, high or low, healthy or morbid, can claim independence from organic processes. And he goes on to discredit spiritual states because they can be traced to organic component. And anyone who does that in James, thinking, that's illogical and arbitrary. So he doesn't subscribe to that at all, which I think is actually important, because I think what he's really wanting to get at, and which very much interests me, is the neurological underpinnings of the experience we have, why we behave the way we do, why we think the way that we do, why we experience life the way that we do. And he really starts to explore some of the complexity which they were just starting to understand. They were just starting to understand the unconscious. But in his second lecture, he makes it clear he's not a theologian, he's not an anthropologist, but his field of study is psychology. And this is the reason he's examining these experiences on an individual level as they relate to human experience in psychological terms. While some might initially question his choice of extreme cases, which he sometimes refers to as psychopathic, his reason for doing so is to bring the greatest possible contrast so that the nature of the experience is clear. Now, his use of the word psychopathic isn't the same as we use today. To try to bring it into our parlance, he doesn't mean that. To us, a psychopath is someone who's immoral and antisocial. In James' view, the extreme religious examples he highlights would classify them as geniuses in the realm of the spirit and at the same time eccentric or even insane. So his concern is what are the results of these experiences. He points out that art is not judged by the mental state of the artist. The artist Van Gogh immediately appears to mind because we know how tortured he was. But we love his work. So his work was wonderful in spite of the fact that he was, a poached egg. He intends to take the same approach with religious experience in terms of what they actually produce. And he asks the question, and this is the pragmatist in James, what are their fruits? What do they produce? What good do they do for society as a whole? That's really his question. And I think that's underlying a lot of his lectures and a lot of what he's going for.
Yeah, and it's interesting that how little influence he has on the field of philosophy today, or in the last few decades. So he has enormous influence on individuals. And this book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, is perhaps one of the top 5 books talked about in American religious circles. Yet on the formal field of philosophy, he's had almost no influence. But in popular life, he's had enormous influence. Anyway, back to you, Richard.
No, that makes sense, because when you read James, there's a depth and compassion and consideration. This is a guy who is really a very gentle spirit in so many ways, and you can feel it in his writing. He's not pompous, and a lot of scholars kind of tend toward that. You don't get that from his writing. You don't get any of that. I read a lot of scholarly literature, and he just doesn't have that. He's really interested in uncovering what's true. He's really interested in understanding this.
And also his pragmatic attitude is just, there's no gnosis in it. So scholars love secret knowledge. So the upper classes, the cultural classes, the chattering classes love to use words, terminologies, and perspectives on life that nobody else can understand, because that sets the aristocrats apart from everyone else. And so with James, he speaks in the language of common men, and he uses the most simplest sounding ideas and arguments that an intelligent person could possibly make. So there's no exciting hidden knowledge that many scholars find so enchanting with Marxism or various forms of French or German ideologies. But William James is pragmatic, and he writes in a way that someone with a 10th grade education could understand. And I think that probably causes a lack of excitement among many academics.
Yeah, that doesn't come as any great shock, and I think you're right. His language is a little bit archaic from our standpoint, but as you read it, it's actually very easy to understand. It's just he doesn't write the way we write and speak today. It's a little, but what's interesting is when you read the big book, you can see his influence stamped all over the writing of that book.
Yeah,
because some of the language and some of the vernacular and just the way that the things are conceptualized, you can see it just came right out of William James. And we know what tremendous influence 12-step has had from a pragmatic standpoint. In fact, it's almost like you can see it as an outgrowth of James' work.
Yeah, and similarly with William James, 12-step has attracted very little academic study. In fact, only in the past few months have we had a new academic study of 12-step work since 1979. So 1979, I'm trying to remember the guy's name, Ernie Kurtz, We Are Not God. Okay, that's the last academic study that the 12-step really has had. And so then we got a new book on the big book that just came out a few months ago, but there was a 40-year gap there between serious academic study of 12-step programs, and that's because, again, perhaps it's just too pragmatic. So pragmatic is all about what works, and academics love theories. They love elaborate theories, generally speaking. And so I think both William James and the 12-step approach are the embodiment of pragmatism, their approaches to life based on what works rather than on teleology, the study of ultimate causes. And so I think this is just lacking sufficient excitement for academics, intellectuals who tend to be predisposed to gnosis, meaning secret knowledge that they're.
Well,
Go ahead.
let's, and you know, you always have to follow the money. 12 steppers don't charge for what they do. You know, if you have special knowledge, you can become an expert and you can charge people gobs of money for it. Well, we
Yeah,
don't do that. You know,
yeah,
basically, you know, we're forever non-professional, but you know, our service centers may employ special workers who do work for the benefit of the fellowship. People don't charge for this. It's just freely given. You know, it's freely received and freely given away. All we do is basically support the meetings, and you know, that's never really been popular in any kind of religious circles or educational circles, because people want to make money from it.
right. So in AA, they won't take any money from anyone outside the program, and they also won't take any more than $2,000 a year. So many people have left their entire estates to AA, but AA will not accept the money because they don't want the struggle for power and prestige to pervert the program. And so the AA approach and the William James approach is kind of the very opposite of the Kabbalah Center, which is that we will sell you secret knowledge for thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So there are thousands of people out there who will sell you secret knowledge to turn your life around for thousands of dollars. 12-step and William James offer you a pragmatic approach to life that is essentially free, and you use it or don't use it, or you adapt it depending on how it works for you. Very different from, say, the Kabbalah Center or the Scientology approach.
Which, and that really comports with how James saw this, because he was looking at this from the standpoint of observing phenomena. Now that's very interesting. That's a very interesting part of religion and religious experience. I want to go look. I want to stay with the lectures a little bit, but I want to. I have a couple points that I make in here. So, in his opinion, religious experiences, you know, in organized religions, are based on the experience of a small group of the leaders who then just expand out to this group of, you know, followers. That's why he's not interested in organized religion, because he's looking for the essence of that religious experience. What is that? He's really asking himself, what is it going on with these people? You know, the essence of religion, he says, are the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider divine. He also makes a distinction between religion and moral or philosophical systems. Like he cites Stoicism as one example. The distinction in his mind is that religion combines a moral system with that particular positive sentiment that supports its practice. And that's really kind of pivotal, because what is it that causes people to believe in something? And that belief is when it's a faith that's based in that kind of positive experience, is something that's really unshakable. And you see that over and over and over again in these examples that he gives. And I'll go a little bit further with the lectures. And this is partly what I think he's getting at. In lecture 3, he tackles what he titles the reality of the unseen. He frames this as psychological peculiarities seen in people who believe in an unseen order. Now, he points out that philosopher Immanuel Kant said that objects of belief such as God and the soul and the like are not objects of knowledge, since they lack evidence as observed by the senses. As a psychologist, James asserts that the sentiment of reality can strongly attach itself to the objects of belief to the point where a person's life is, as he puts it, polarized through and through by its sense of the existence of the thing believed in. James further asserts that the concrete universe abounds in abstract ideas, including time, space, goodness, beauty, strength, justice, and so forth. And he points out that people relate to these abstract ideas as they might relate to a person. He notes that Plato observed this and used it as a defense for the common human feeling in which intellect is aware of something beyond the world we can see, touch, feel, taste, and smell. He also points out that the ethical societies of his day, which rejected the idea of God in the traditional sense, still embraced and even worshipped an abstract divine, which they called moral law. This is kind of important. People like C.S. Lewis, looked at this, and he was a Christian theologian, very, very staunch about that. So he believed in God, but he also looked at this phenomena of moral law, of that there are conditions in the universe. I like to call it moral physics. That there's some things that are just there, and we observe them, and we don't really have answers as to why they're there. But now, as he puts it, it's as if there were in the human consciousness a sense of reality, a feeling of objective presence of perception of what we may call something there, more deep and more general than any of the special and particular senses by which the current psychology supposes existent realities to be originally revealed. To interject at this point a similar observation from the A.A. Big book, the writers observe, actually, we're fooling ourselves. For deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things, but in some form or other, it's there. For faith in a power greater than ourselves and miraculous demonstrations of that power in human lives are facts as old as man himself. We finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup just as much as is the feeling we have for a friend. I think this last sentence really gets the point James is trying to make, which is the manner in which people relate to the God idea, which is relational, more like someone than something. And I think that's very important. Partly, I think that's important because, well, as a Christian, I believe that God is personal, that God has feelings, God has emotions, and it's the ultimate version of our own emotions since we're made in his image. That's why I think, in particular, that's important. We'll get to that a little bit more, I think. In lecture 4 and 5, James starts to expand on his idea, this twofold typology of religion. The first 2 lectures deal with the religion of healthy mindedness, is what he calls it. In fact, he begins the lecture, if we were to ask, what is human life's chief concern? One of the answers we should receive would be, it's happiness. How to gain, how to keep, how to recover happiness is, in fact, for most men and all times, the secret motive of all they do and all they are willing to endure. That's an incredible statement. And, that's what people want. When Jesus is on the Sermon on the Mount, he said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. That word, blessed, is the Greek word makarios. That word means flourishing, well-being. It was usually referred to as wealthy people who had no worries and no problems and just were loving life. And it's a little bit like James is just describing in these healthy-minded people who just have no problems at all. Life is just wonderful and it's just beautiful and nothing goes wrong. That's something that everybody wants. And James really points that out. He references Francis Newman, who said, God has 2 families of children on this earth, the once born and the twice born. Now, James deals with the twice born in the lectures that follow on the sick soul. Newman describes the once born like this. They see God not as a glorious potentate or strict judge, but as the animating spirit of the beautiful, harmonious world, beneficent and kind, merciful as well as pure. They do not look back into themselves, hence they're not distressed by their own imperfections. Yet it would be absurd to call them self-righteous, for they hardly think of themselves at all. It could be said that the once born insist on the dignity rather than the depravity of man. And I think that's a very important point of departure. because and that philosophically was a point of departure at that time, because so many people were rejecting that notion of sin and hell and beating their breasts and saying, I'm a sinner, I'm rotten, I'm worthless. People don't want that. They don't want that. I don't think God wants that either, but that's another story. James calls the once born healthy-minded, and he gives many examples. He includes a statement by Hilty. In many persons, happiness is congenital, and the reclaimable cosmic emotion inevitably takes in them the form of enthusiasm and freedom. I speak not only of those who are animally happy, I mean those who, when unhappiness is offered or proposed to them, positively refuse to feel it as if it were something mean or wrong. The spectrum he portrays also includes these negative reflections from men 45 years in business. This reminds me of my dad. I have some little experience of life in men and women, and I find that most religious and pious people, as a rule, lacking in uprightness and morality, that men who do not go to church or have religious convictions are the best. Praying, singing of hymns, and sermonizing are pernicious. They teach us to rely on some supernatural power when we ought to rely on ourselves. I love this. I totally disbelieve in God. The contempt and sarcasm of that is miraculous. The God idea was begotten in ignorance, fear, and the general lack of any knowledge of nature. James does make the point that while this individual rejects traditional religious practice, in his terminology, the statements do reflect a religious experience according to the way that he defines it. That's his religion. What that man just described was his religious experience, how he deals with that. So in lectures 6 and 7, completes this typology of religion by considering what, when he terms the sick soul, he refers to as the twice born. James says, in contrast with healthy-minded views, if we treat them as a way of deliberately minimizing evil, stands a radically opposite view, a way of maximizing evil, if you please to call it, based on the persuasion that the evil aspects of our life are of its very essence, and that the world's meaning comes most home to us when we lay them most at heart. I think James understood the healthy-minded, but I also have this notion that he felt that that wasn't actually a realistic view of life. And he goes on, and we'll touch on that a little bit more. The lectures that follow, 8 on the divided self and the process of communication, 9 and 10 on the conversion experience, lectures 11, 12, and 13 on saintliness, and lectures 14 and 15 on the value of saintliness, weigh much heavier on the side of the religious experience of the sick soul. On the one hand, this doesn't come as a surprise. I mean, James is a psychologist, and I think he has an interest in the pathology. But I also think that it's due to James' own experience, given that after he at great length discusses the experiences of Tolstoy and Bunyan, he includes what most people believe to be an autobiographical account of his own experience. James reflects, to begin with, how can things so insecure as the successful experiences of this world afford stable anchorage? A really important question. A chain is no stronger than its weakest link, and life is, after all, a chain. In the healthiest and most prosperous existence, how many links of illness, danger, and disaster are always interposed? Even if we suppose a man so packed with healthy-mindedness as never to have experienced in his own person any of these sobering intervals, still, if he is a reflecting being, he must generalize that his own lot and compare it with that of others, and in so doing, he has to see that his escape is just lucky chance and no essential difference. He might just as well have been born into an entirely different fortune. Tolstoy, who was by material measure very successful, reached a turning point. I felt, he says, that something had broken within me on which my life had always rested, that I had nothing left to hold on to, and that my life had stopped, and an invincible force impelled me to get rid of my existence in one way or another. It was an aspiration of my whole being to get out of life. I have, frankly, in 12-step, I talk to people who are like that, people who are clinically depressed, they get like that. And in reading this from James' standpoint, you begin to have a deeper respect and compassion for the complexity of the human experience. James is fascinated by the mystery of the human experience. And he treats it with a thoroughness and care that I think a lot of the people we talked about earlier who are into arcane or Gnostic knowledge, or trying to be part of a cabal or some secret society so they can give you secret knowledge, I think they're not interested in that kind of truth, because that would come too close to home. They would have to start looking at themselves that way, and if they did, they would probably not choose to do the things that they're doing.
A question: does James speak about his own personal religious experiences, or does he just hint at these struggles with melancholy?
Well, okay. I'm going to get to that. I'm actually going to read a section of that which follows after Bunyan's experience.
Okay.
Because the way he portrays that, it's like he's talking, well, somebody else said this, like a friend, like you go to somebody and say, hey, a friend of mine is having this experience, you're really asking about yourself, but you don't want to let on. That's kind of the way he positions it. But I think most people are of the belief that this was James talking about his direct experience. And when we get to that one, just right after we finish Bunyan, because I want to mention, I want to highlight his pathology, because that's one thing that James does. And I think even though it's an extreme, I think it points to, I don't know, in my experience, I talk to people who have a lot of strange fears. And I know you probably do too. And I've had my own set of them too. And the thing is, we're all subject to them. And, to have it out in the open and to look at it is helpful, because it gives us more in common in the human experience that sometimes we lack. Now, John Bunyan troubles over the condition of his own personal self. He's a typical case of the psychopathic temperament, sensitive of conscience to a disease degree, beset by doubts, fears, and insistent ideas, and a victim of verbal automatism, both motor and sensory. So he says, my original inward pollution was my plague. In my affliction, by reason of that, I was more loathsome in my own eyes than was a toad, and I thought I was so in God's eyes too. Sin and corruption, I would as naturally bubble out of my heart as water would bubble out of a fountain. I would have changed my heart with anybody. The earth seemed accursed for my sake. All trees, plants, rocks, hills, and vales seemed to be dressed in mourning and groaning under the weight of the curse, and everything around me seemed to be conspiring my ruin. That's not a fun place to be. The worst kind of melancholy is that which takes the form of panic, fear. And here is an excellent example. I believe this is James talking about himself. For permission to print which, I have to thank the sufferer. The original is in French, and that the subject was evidentially in a bad nervous condition at the time of which he writes his case, has otherwise the merit of extreme simplicity, and I translate freely. James was fluent in German and French. He traveled in Europe extensively. So it's just interesting that he doesn't really come out and say it, but I think the general consensus is that this is him. Whilst in this state,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Do we get the sense that James really wants a religious experience, or is he just someone who's akin to an insectologist who pokes insects and says you're all very interesting, but he doesn't want to become an insect?
That's a really good question. I haven't actually formed an opinion about that, but
Well, I have formed an opinion, so while you think about it, I'll give my opinion, and that is he does not want a religious experience because he lived his life without participating in religion. This was wide open, available to him as to anyone else in a free country, and the fact that he did not choose that shows that he was never particularly interested in a religious experience, except in say the same way that I like to read spy novels. I'm interested in a spy experience, or I like adventure films because action films because I like looking at movies of people fighting each other, but I have no real life desire to participate in risking my life in fighting. So I kind of sense with William James and with people like Joseph Campbell that they're interested in the religious in the same way that people who study insects are interested in insects. That they don't want to become insects, but they enjoy the intellectual and psychological challenge of trying to figure out what's going on here. So that James himself never developed his own religiosity, never participated in organized religion, and doesn't really explicitly speak about any transcendent experiences that he has, makes it pretty obvious to me that his interest in the varieties of the religious experience is the same as that of, say, an archaeologist who's unearthing special bowls and trinkets from 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. So he's interested, but in no sense does he want to participate. Just like I have no desire to get shot at, but I enjoy movies and novels about people who are getting shot at.
okay, I can see why, since he really doesn't come out and state that, but that's something that I want to actually think about. Maybe we'll visit that at another time. But this is kind of his experience, and I think when confronted with the horror of life and the fragility of life, I think that has a profound effect on him. And I think my personal sense is he would like to have a religious experience, but perhaps didn't know how to permit himself to do so, and this may have driven his exploration of this further to understand it so he could give himself permission. That's a distinct possibility as well, because he defends these experiences so strongly. He really does. He defends them, unlike someone who was just interested in the insects would say, well, okay, so they're insects, so what? It's interesting, but I don't want to be an insect. I think he counts himself a compassionate human being, and I think his opinion about religious experience is that is profoundly part of the human experience, not organized religion, but the experience of the divine is something that I think he holds as vitally important, perhaps even to himself. I haven't read enough of his work to conclude as to whether he came to that understanding or did that. He may have had his dad was pretty religious, and who knows what their home life was like. Maybe he just didn't like the way his dad tried to make him do stuff. Who knows? Okay, but here's what I believe. This is maybe some insight into James' perspective, at least about the human experience and where a religious experience might make a difference. Whilst in the state of philosophic pessimism and general depression of spirits about my prospects, I went one evening into a dressing room in the twilight to procure some article that was there, when suddenly there fell upon me without any warning, just as if it came out of the darkness, a horrible fear of my own existence. Simultaneously, there arose in my mind the image of an epileptic patient whom I had seen in the asylum, a black-haired youth with greenish skin, entirely idiotic, who used to sit all day on one of the benches or other shelves against the wall with his knees drawn up against his chin in the coarse gray undershirt, which was his only garment, drawn over them, enclosing his entire figure. He sat there like a sort of sculpted Egyptian cat or Peruvian mummy, moving nothing but his black eyes and looking absolutely non-human. This image and my fear entered into a species of combination with each other that shape I am. I felt potentially nothing that I possess can defend me against that fate if the hour for it should strike me as it struck for him. James, who spent a considerable amount of time in Europe, was fluent in both French and German. That he included this what most understand to be a very personal experience may have contributed to his decision to focus on the sick soul than the healthy-minded. James observes the fact of interest for us is that, as a matter of fact, they could and did find something welling up in the reaches of their consciousness by which such extreme sadness could be overcome. This is the essence of religious experience of the twice-born individual. And I think that he would classify himself as twice-born, because I think he had this experience. He suffered with depression, and he suffered with, bouts of what he would call melancholy. And, his desire for religious experience would be to overcome that. What he did with that, how he translated that, how he transformed that. Again, I haven't quite read enough to really come to that conclusion.
Okay, great. Go ahead. Did you have a finishing thought there?
No, you had a question. I'm much more interested in your questions.
No, I don't. So I'll let you finish your lecture.
Okay. Well, it's more like a discussion with some guidance here. Lecture 8 is about the divided self and the process of unification. This is such a common human experience. Most of us have this. That he says that everybody has this. He argues that the experience of the sick soul is psychologically rooted in an individual having a disordered constitution, presented in the lecture as the presence of two conflicting selves in one person. Normal personal development consists in the unifying of these two selves, but it's not always successful at the unification, and it's characterized as unhappiness when you're not there. So that experience of unhappiness is very real. James also emphasizes the distinction between healthy-minded and the sick soul by pointing out that despite the unification of their souls, neither Tolstoy or Bunyan have become healthy-minded, and argues that the previous experience of both preclude this categorization. He considers them twice born. In lectures 9 and 10, after he's outlined the unification of the disordered soul, James focuses on specifically religious instances of this phenomenon. He calls it conversion. As far as James is concerned, to be converted means that religious ideas move from a peripheral place in one's consciousness to center stage. Because of this rearrangement, these religious ideas assume a central role in the convert's energy and motivation. James admits that psychology doesn't provide a clear answer to why this happens. He also draws a distinction between what he calls volitional conversion, which is a primarily conscious process, taking place over a protracted amount of time, and self-surrender conversion, which involves the convert letting go and allowing themselves to be converted. Now, Bill W.'s religious experience described in the Big Book is of this second type. Again, looking at James' influence in the Alcoholics Anonymous Fellowship, AA conversion experiences are described in the appendix as follows. The terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are used many times in this book, which, upon careful reading, shows that the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself among us in many forms. Yet, it's true that our first printing gave many readers the impression that these personality changes or religious experiences must be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheavals. Happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. In the first few chapters, a number of sudden revolutionary changes are described, though it was not our intention to create such an impression that many alcoholics nevertheless have concluded that in order to recover, they must acquire an immediate and overwhelming God consciousness. Looks like they were passing this book around. And they had the impression that acquiring this overwhelming God consciousness had to be followed at once by a vast change in feeling and outlook. In our rapidly growing membership of thousands of alcoholics, such transformations, though frequent, are by no means the rule. Most of our experience are what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, because they develop over a period of time. Bill Wilson describes his own experience this way. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but at the moment I fully accepted them. The effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I have never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up so as the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. Now, I just want to compare this to one of the experiences William James talks about, which was early on in the conversion lectures. He talks about Stephen Bradley's experience. He says, I began to feel my heartbeat very quick all of a sudden, which made me at first think that perhaps something is going to ail me, although I was not alarmed, for I felt no pain. My heart increased in its feeling, and which soon convinced me that it was the Holy Spirit from the effect it had on me. I began to feel exceedingly happy and humble in such a sense of unworthiness as I've never felt before. I could not help very well speaking out loud, which I did, and said, Lord, I don't deserve this happiness, or words to that effect. While there was a stream resembling liquid feeling came into my mouth and heart in a more sensible manner than that of drinking anything, which continued as near as I could judge for about 5 minutes. It took complete possession of my soul. And I am certain that I asked the Lord, and I desire of you while in the midst of this, not to give me more happiness, for it seemed as if I could not contain what I was being given. It seemed that I would burst if I did not stop. But it still didn't stop until I felt I was utterly full of the love and grace of God. That's a very distinctly religious conversion experience.
Okay, let me jump in here a little bit. So Bill W. describes what you just read a couple of minutes ago, where you feel a clean wind blowing through you. And Bill W. claimed that after that, he never again experienced a yearning to drink. And so a lot of the early people in AA, they were very envious and never had such an experience. So they had to change the wording from what was the change from a dramatic spiritual experience to a spiritual awakening? Yeah, that was the change. And so I think in the 21st century, I really only know the cultures of the United States and Australia very well. It seems like in both 12-step programs and in religions that we have to compete with movies and perhaps even yoga or anything that provides dramatic personal transformations. So many people are looking for drama. Many people are looking for a mountaintop experience like what Bill W. described. I think many people are yearning for an experience such as the people had in the Steven Spielberg movie E.T. or in the Steven Spielberg movies Star Wars, or some other fantastical, emotional, shattering experience that they've seen in movies, they've read in novels, they've seen in comic books, that they may have even had tastes of it in yoga, or that they've experienced it in sexual experimentation or drug experimentation. And so it's a pretty high bar, and most people in 12-step programs and most people in organized religion do not seem to have these shattering mountaintop experiences. Any thoughts?
That's such a great point, because I actually deal with that a lot. The way I describe that is that, someone would ask me, well, what's God's will for me? And you can sense that what they expect is, they expect a burning bush to show up in their living room and tell them, I am the Lord God and do this. That's what they expect. Now, that's even the experiences that James describes in this book. Most of them are very brief, episodic, and, didn't happen very often. But they happen to the people, like during the Great Awakening, John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards, they talk about these things happening just spontaneously. Now, I have observed this. I have seen this in my own experience. And I think it's probably relevant for me to describe this. I have had brief experiences like this. And I want to describe them because I think I agree with what James says about them, that these experiences are what give us the sense, anchor the understanding that there's something greater than just what our senses report to us. There were really 4 experiences that were very distinct. The first one, and it sort of fits into the category of what James talks about, drug-induced religious experiences. Okay, I grew up in the '60s, and one day after a rally on the UCLA campus, I went home with my friends, went to their house in the Palisades, and they had some peyote, some marijuana, and some other things, and we just, really did indulge in that. And I had an experience which was completely unforgettable. The experience I had was, as the sun went down, as I started to feel the effects of the drugs, I somehow got in my head the idea that I had died. I felt these hot flashes in my body, and I thought, I'm laying in the road, back where we picked this stuff up. And because what it felt like, how when you scratch yourself and you feel the raw skin and you feel blood oozing out, that's what it felt like. So I just sort of had that impression. So literally, I thought I had died. And I thought that where I was at that moment in time was where I was going to spend all of eternity. What a frightening thought. But I mean, I literally lived in that until the sun came up that next morning. That was the thing that sort of broke this idea of changed the reality of that. And of course, the drugs were off too. but that experience was the first time, people describe that experience of standing outside of yourself and looking at yourself. That is a very important component of living an examined life. You have to be able to step outside of yourself and look at your behavior and do what I think Jordan Peterson describes as getting to know yourself as a stranger, looking at yourself not like it's you, but like it's this being that you're watching from another perspective. And James talks about that. He talks about the different selves, and this is the one he talks about. He describes it as the super ego. That's actually not the term he uses. It's the I, whereas the other ones are me. You observe these things, you observe your physical components, you observe your social components, you observe those things, and you describe those as something that you are. But this I is something separate from that. And that's actually, if you don't have that experience, you never understand your own behavior. You never realize that you actually have choices. You're always like an animal in the midst of that behavior and really don't see it in a way that empowers you to make choices about it, which is, frankly, one of the essentials in recovery is that you can kind of step back and see who you are. So that was actually the first experience I had of that. And it shook me. I stopped using drugs after that. I really did. I really did. It scared the crap out of me, but in a good way. I was scared sane. And I didn't do it for a number of years. Anyway, the three other experiences I had were one time I had been reading quite a bit and was starting to, I had heard the gospel, I'd kind of accepted it, but I wasn't going to church. It was just, oh, that's nice. I didn't really think I had to do anything about it. But there were things that were happening. And I was sitting in my bedroom, and all of a sudden, I just felt like I was completely surrounded by this presence. The only way I can describe it, it was a sense that I was surrounded by energy and mind that was moving in every direction all at once in perfect order. That's the only way I can describe it. And it was very real, and it lasted probably for about 15 minutes. And I had no idea what it was at the time. I look back at it now and I said, that's, especially through the filter of what James talks about, is that was a spiritual experience of something beyond where beyond this, time and space continuum. Scientists will tell us that there's 10 dimensions of reality, 4 of which we can perceive, the rest of which we can infer them mathematically and by other means. And I think one of the things that James gets at is that, and he kind of holds the line for this, he says that stuff is really out there, and our unconsciousness and these other levels of experience beyond our consciousness are part of how we connect to that. He believed that because he really argues for that. Another one was I was laying in my bed, and all of a sudden it was like the veil of reality was peeled back, and I heard singing like I can't even describe. It was the most beautiful thing that I had ever heard. And it felt more real than reality itself. It felt more real than everything that I've ever experienced. People talk about, near-death experiences. They have the feeling that the world they enter into is more real than the world that they just left. That's how I would describe that. It was hyper real. And it lasted for about 2 minutes. And it was over. But I can never unexperience that. I can't make that go away. And I don't want to. It was incredible. And I feel that there was something very real about that. This is what James talks about. He says that to the person who experiences them, they're very real. You can't quantify them. You can't measure them by scientific means, but for the people who've experienced them, they are more real than all of the things that science can measure. That's the point he makes in the book. And he makes it pretty strongly. The last one was a little bit more definite and religious in more the traditional sense. I was dating a Catholic girl, and so I spent a lot of time, in church with her. Not that I was going for her, not for myself. I was not that interested at the time. But after we broke up, I was pretty sad, pretty confused, really didn't know what to do. So there was a Catholic church down the street, so I started going there because it was comforting to me. I would go and I would listen to the service, and it comforted me. And this one Sunday afternoon, I'm in church, and it's communion time. Of course, I knew I wasn't a Catholic, so I knew I'm not supposed to take communion, right? You don't take communion if you're not a Catholic. Only Catholics can do that. So I'm sitting there, and the communion time comes, and people are starting to go up, and I hear this voice behind me say, "Go up there and take that right now." I looked around, there was nobody there. And I sat there, like bewildered. What's that? And again, "Go up there and take that right now." And the tone of the voice reminded me of when I was like, when my dad was getting serious with me, he would use all three of my names: Richard Joseph Harris. It was that tone. And I said, "Okay, I'm going." Because what I think I experienced was the audible voice of God telling me to do that. That's because there was no person there saying that, and it was audible. And so I went up there, I went up to the rail, and I knew what to do. I'd had enough exposure that I went up and I kneel down and put my hands up, do all that. So they did that, and I was like paranoid, because I thought, oh my God, the acolyte police are going to come and take me away in handcuffs, and take me to the rectory and beat me. You're not Catholic, you're not supposed to do that. Of course, none of that ever happened. I went up, I took communion, just very matter-of-factly, went home, went to the refrigerator after I got home, pulled out the stuff, made a sandwich, sat down, and I had gotten into the habit of saying a prayer over my food. Sat down, said a prayer over my food, and when I opened my eyes, it was like somebody had switched on the lights from the inside out. It's like my whole body was lit up. And the way I often describe it is like somebody turned on the light switch in my soul that had been dark all my life. That's very much akin to the Bill W. story. Something completely changed. I was never the same after that. Never the same. It was such and I was not expecting that to happen. This was not something that I planned. This was not something I anticipated. This is not something I said, well, I hope this happens. Nothing like that. I was just minding my own business going, and then go up there and take that now, and boom. So those 4 experiences, I class very much in the same realm as what William James is talking about. And when I look back at those things, they have a lot to do with why I practice the faith I do in the way that I do. Because there's a reality to it that, for me, is inescapable. And frankly, I don't want to escape it.
Okay.
Because yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Finish your thought.
No. That's great.
Okay.
I think that's the majority of it right there.
So I don't believe I've ever had any experiences akin to what you've had, but at the same time, I'm consciously aware that I may have indeed had similar experiences to what you've described or what Bill W. described, but I don't want to admit to them because they may then impel me to change things that I don't want to change. So I have heavy skepticism of myself, but I don't think I've ever had any mountaintop experiences like that. I've had a sense of communion with God, but nothing as dramatic as what you've described. I think the most dramatic event in my life occurred in 6th grade. The most wonderful event in my life occurred in 6th grade, when the most beautiful girl in the class dropped a note on my desk asking me to go with her. Compared to the intensity of that experience, the discovery that a beautiful girl could love me, nothing else has come close to that in my whole life. Nothing else has been as thrilling and as fulfilling and as ecstatic and transcendent experience as then when I think Cindy just dropped that note on my desk, and I suddenly realized I was loved by the most beautiful woman in the class. And compared to that, none of my religious or spiritual experiences come even close. Now, at the same time, I'm skeptical of myself, and I'm very aware of my own ability to kind of deaden experiences that I may not want to have for various reasons. So, no, that's too personal. But it's very possible to have experiences that will force you to change your life in ways that you don't want to change your life. That you may have sacrificed a great deal to achieve a certain kind of life, and that kind of life may be very congenial for you in so many ways, and then you have this very awkward experience that completely revolutionizes your soul and your life and forces you to go in a whole new direction that you really don't want to go in. And so I'm afraid of that kind of experience. Also, I think when you're attracted to a text or to a movie or to an experience, you can also ask why does that so speak to you? And so you and I have gone in opposite directions religiously. You were raised Jewish, converted to Christianity. I was raised Christian, converted to Judaism. And one way of understanding the difference between Judaism and Christianity is that at a certain point, a group of Jews had a transcendent experience that sent them in a different direction than what the religious leaders of their time mandated. So I think, and they were the 12 apostles, Jesus, Paul, and so on. They became known as the founders of Christianity. So Roman Catholicism, as I understand it, as I've been told by Roman Catholics, tends to have a great suspicion of religious enthusiasm and these kind of transcendental experiences that completely shake up someone's life. Because Roman Catholicism is a much more regimented, hierarchical religion, which is in no way a criticism of Roman Catholicism. And Judaism also has a very great suspicion of, I experience God, therefore I'm going to go in this direction unless this new direction is mediated by the halakha, by Jewish law. So two of the three major religions in the United States, Roman Catholicism and Judaism, have a great suspicion of religious and spiritual enthusiasm if it deviates in any way from established practices. Now, 12-step primarily comes from the Protestant tradition, which is very much the individual meeting God, the individual being born again. And so that's why it was so humbling for me when I entered 12-step and I would hear many of the same teachings that I got as a Christian growing up, and I'm thinking, like, what the hell? How am I back here doing all this stuff that I consciously rejected? I ran 5,000 miles away from this stuff, and now I am very awkwardly and coming back to it and having to go to the bloody meetings in churches. Do you think I really enjoy stepping back into churches to go to 12-step meetings when I've so consciously gone in the very opposite direction? I'm sitting in these Protestant churches. I'm having all these memories of my Protestant childhood. There are all these photos of Protestant clergy up on the room, on the walls, and they all have the kind of beneficent Protestant look that I remember from my childhood. And it's like, why, Lord, why did you send me back here? This is what I was running away from. So I've had to be humbled to accept that experience. And then I had an additional thought. I think that one reason why for so many people they want this mountaintop experience is that most people are fundamentally lazy. And people think that if they have this mountaintop experience, that they will then have it easy, that then the 12 steps will just be all running downhill. And it just doesn't work that way. I mean, if you take the Bible seriously, all sorts of people in the Bible experience God, and then a little while later, they were participating in an orgy, which is what the children of Israel did. They got the 10 commandments from God at Mount Sinai, and then the next chapter, they're participating in an orgy with Midianite women. So all sorts of people, as portrayed by the Bible, have a genuine experience with God that you would think would completely shake them up, and then a few days later they're off committing an orgy. So I think for all those people who want that mountaintop experience, thinking that will then supercharge their recovery, I think it's largely underwritten by laziness, by a desire not to have to do painful self-confronting work and hoping that they have a mountaintop experience, God will blow in, that clean wind will blow in, will blow out all the things that were screwing up their lives, and that God will then do the work for them. And to me, it's that desire is a desire for cheap grace. And I had one other thought. One final thought on this is that similarly, many people want to have a transcendent experience of falling in love. And if they don't fall in love with someone when they meet them or on the first couple of dates, then they think, oh, we're just not suited. Yet for at least half the population, like me, we tend to make quite poor choices when we rely on that ecstatic falling in love experience, as opposed to a more monotonous experience where you slowly build something because you have certain common commitments, or because your spouse has been chosen for you by your community or by your parents. Okay, any thoughts?
Oh, that's so good. And you know, in so many ways, I heartily agree with you. My experience, you know, though I've had those experiences, you know, they didn't necessarily lead me into a better life
Yeah.
by them in and of themselves. And I don't necessarily think that's the purpose of them. And I think that's something that's misunderstood. Um, you know, I'm going to skip around a little bit, but in lecture 18, James examines the question about religious experience. Can they justify a belief in God? Now, for James, he stresses the primacy of the emotional religious experience. He rejects the idea that religion must be rationally demonstrated independent of any private feeling, which is exactly what the Catholics do, and what Judaism tends to do. We want to focus on what our brain tells us. Not wrong, but James asserts that philosophy and theology would never have started had there not been felt experiences to prompt the philosophical reflections. That's the way he puts it. And so, you know, someone like Buddha, someone like Paul had these experiences, and they took the time. I mean, before Paul started writing anything of any consequence, he spent 10 years, you know, learning. He spent 3 years in the desert, you know, before he even started, you know, going out there and getting involved with other people. So there was a long process of transformation, and there's a lot that it takes. And I think for me, I agree with you, is that people they just want to be fixed. They just want to, here, I want to have this and I want to have it now, and I don't want to have to work for it. That's why I think rehab centers don't work. Rehab, by and large, doesn't work. Why? The human brain is very complex. And this is something that James gets at when he talks about the nature of how these religious experiences come about. When he talks about someone like John Bunyan went through this long, protracted, you know, season of emotional distress. Torture would be the best way to describe it. And that was him kind of working out, letting his own mind work out those things, because there's a lot to the human psyche that we still don't understand. And I think James would say we cannot just simply dismiss the idea that there's something beyond what we immediately experience. You know, as so many psychologists and biologists say, oh no, all that stuff, all your consciousness, that's just the bubbling and fizzing of your brain. When that bubbling and fizzing stops, it all goes away. I'm not persuaded of that at all. I think there's way more to it. And one of the reasons I think there's way more to it is just on the nature of the information that undergirds everything that exists. You understand the complexity of DNA and how that works, and the fact that that had to be inserted full born. The idea that it evolved by random chance is mathematically impossible. And science, more and more scientists are coming to that conclusion that, yeah, it sounds good on the surface, but Darwin didn't understand how complex the cell was. He didn't understand that the human genetic code is a 3 billion character word, you know, that tells the body how to do those things, and that all of those processes that make it happen, even to the fact of dividing and copying it, have to all be in place in order for it to happen. That screams intelligent design. That screams that something outside of time and space said, here's the information you need, because information doesn't have any mass. That's a really fascinating thing about information. You know, my cell phone weighs, 8.9 ounces, whether it has 0 gigabytes or 100 gigabytes of information on it, weighs the same. Why? Because information has no mass. It exists in a medium. And if you extrapolate that kind of thinking to who we are as conscious beings and the nature of consciousness, you really come up against a dilemma. And, scientists today call it the hard problem of consciousness. And that's one of the things that James was really getting at in his conclusions and in the chapter on mysticism.
So the business model of rehab is that you have to obviously do enough good to encourage people to come in, but if you cure people, then you don't make any more money off them. So I know a lot of people who would rather that their insurance spent $40,000 sending them to rehab, but they don't want to do the hard work of the 12 steps. So they'll do the first 2 steps, maybe the first 3 steps. But I share your skepticism of rehab. William James reminds me a lot of Jordan Peterson in that they're both
yes.
deeply troubled people. So Jordan Peterson has had his own lifelong struggle with depression, his own horrible struggle with nightmares. He's gone off the deep end over the past year with a benzodiazepine addiction. He's trying to get treated for it in Russia. He may indeed never come back from it. And then they both remind me a bit of my father. My father wrote all these books on happiness and on how to stop worrying, and my father was about the most unhappy, filled with worry guy that I ever knew. So all 3 of them are coming from the perspective of deeply wounded, deeply troubled people who have grappled with depression, have stared at it in the face, may have a whole lifelong experience with it, and come to some thoughts. But on the other hand, they are very deeply troubled people, and so that would prompt one to have some skepticism with regard to their insights, because when you come from a deeply troubled place, often the insights that you come to, I guess sometimes they're brilliant, but also sometimes they're dangerous or dangerously flawed. Any thoughts?
I really like Jordan Peterson, and I like the fact that you compare him to William James, because I think they're comparable in many, many ways, on a lot of levels. They're very thoughtful. I love the fact that Jordan Peterson is a clinician, and that his experience with patients and the human psyche and human flaws and depravity and all those other things is what's formed his understanding. And I think that's really important. I think James had some of that too, and that may have been one of the reasons he was depressed. I mean, if that was him in that example, he was probably, as a doctor in the hospital, looking at this patient and going, what if I end up like that guy? What stops me from ending up like that? And it scared the crap out of him. And I think I can understand that. Life doesn't offer a lot of guarantees. We'd like it to, but I think one of the cases that part of the argument that James makes is that the twice born or sick soul who finds redemption, and paradigms of religion that support that, of which I class 12-step, because you have to do the work in order to achieve that. And if you do the work, this is one of the claims of the big book, is that if you do the work, you get the results. And I think that my personal thought about why that is because there are certain characteristics of the created order, one of them being how human beings behave towards one another, the structure that governs human behavior. You could look at it one of two ways. Either it just happens to be random chance and developed by evolution based on survival, or it was put there by intelligent design for a purpose. And if it's the latter, then there really are benchmarks that you can align to. And that happens to be what I think. I think the 10 Commandments, for example, are benchmarks that we can align to. And they're so simple, but they're E equaled MC squared simple. You know, in 12-step, we talk about the 5 major character defects: dishonesty, selfishness, self-centeredness, fearfulness, and inconsideration. What's really fascinating about that is that those ideas and their place in human behavior corresponds almost on a parallel with the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, which are, by the way, two sets of parallels. One set is the vertical version of it, you know, your attitude and relationship with God, and the other one is the horizontal attitude, your relationship towards other people. Up, 5 across. And they really correspond to that. It's really fascinating to me that that's true. And I'm going to just throw another couple of like little curveballs in there. We have 5 fingers. We have 5 senses. I don't know. That's just a little like scratch your head and make you go, kind of coincidence. And I don't want to try to make too much of that in and of itself. But, you know, even our DNA code, it is based on a remarkably simple formula. You have 4 basic chemicals, 4 basic nucleotides, and those 4 basic nucleotides in the different combinations that they can combine in form everything for every living creature. It's a very simple system, but it scales to a remarkable complexity. And I think in the same way, the moral, what I call it, some people call it metaphysics. I'm a little more fond of the phrase moral physics, because I think just as you have gravity, there are moral components to the universe far more complex than gravity. Gravity is really simple. You know, if you walk off a cliff, you fall, you go down, because, you know, gravity acts on the weight of your body until it impacts something that stops the momentum, which could be the ground or a rock or another person or whatever. You know, and that's, if you were to say that was, let's say you say that's God's command, is in relation to gravity. You shall not walk off the edge of a cliff lest you fall and die. It's a command, right? But what's inherent in that command is not that God's a bully, that he doesn't want you to, you know, he says, because I'm God, I'm going to say you can't walk off the cliff. You know, he didn't make it that if you step off the cliff that you're going to just keep walking on air, or that you'll float up. That's not the way he's made it. So what he's doing in those commands is he's informing you about the nature of things. And I think my personal take on this is You know, when God says his commands, I think it's more in the nature of, I'm informing you of how things are. This is how they are. Now, because God always gives choices. You know, if you have the command, here's what I say, but you can do it or not. And that started with Adam. But, you know, even when they got the 10 commandments, he said, you know, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that I put before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life. He's talking about the 10 commandments. He said, there are certain things that if you align yourself to this thing, your life will work. If you don't align yourself to these things, your life won't work. And it's no different, in my opinion, than gravity. It's more complex. And I think it sort of falls into the realm of chaos dynamic mathematics. It's not like, you know, it's not a cause and effect thing. It's more like a complex network of interactions that over time produce certain results. That's my understanding of it.
Okay. So I had a few additional thoughts here. I think religion and spirituality have a lot of powerful critiques of each other. Religion's perhaps most powerful critique of spirituality is that spirituality is pursued by those who want the benefit of being in an organized religion without paying the price. So for those who are spiritual but not religious, they have no community that will hold them accountable. So if you're spiritual but not religious, and you're Jewish, you can eat anything you want. You don't have to keep Sabbath. You don't have to put on tefillin. You don't have to donate to the United Jewish Appeal. You don't have to do anything for Israel. There's nothing externally you can do whereby people can point at you and say you're a hypocrite. And so I have sympathy for the religious critique of spirituality, and at the same time I have sympathy for the spirituality critique of religion. And the spirituality critique of religion is that it can become just an empty shell. It can become just pure formalism. It's just a social club that you belong to, and that if you ever encounter some disabling compulsion that you can't help repeating, whether it's drinking or drugging or porning or chasing the excitement that comes from gambling or overeating, just going to church or going to synagogue, it's not going to deal with it. And you need the spiritual transformation that comes from a 12-step program. But I think both entities have powerful critiques of the other. And one way to understand the difference between religion and spirituality is to look at the difference between a George W. Bush, a man who's religious, and a Barack Obama, a man who's more into spirituality. Then I had some other thoughts here. So William James was a big devotee of the theory of evolution, and something that I've noticed happening within both myself and with a lot of other people is that the more you study natural selection and evolution, the less likely you are to believe in God. That for example, in the life sciences, people who specialize in something like biology, almost none of the PhDs in biology from elite schools believe in God. It's very, very rare. Now, PhDs in the physical sciences such as chemistry, physics, mathematics, so equally cognitively demanding, you do have quite a few people believing in God. But in the life sciences, people whose foundation for looking at the world is through natural selection and evolution, such as a William James, very few of them believe in God. So William James and Carl Jung are the two most influential thinkers on 12-step programs, and neither James nor Jung participated in organized religion. Also, Bill W., the founder of the 12-step program, had a great deal of skepticism of organized religion. He would say some positive things about it, but fundamentally he didn't think it got the job done. So it's interesting that you go from Carl Jung to William James, who, for all his talks about the varieties of the religious experience, if this talk was given today, it would be called The Varieties of the Spiritual Experience. But in William James's time, spirituality was not really a term that was used very much. Also, at the time the Big Book was written, when it talks about religious experiences in the Big Book, it would perhaps be more accurate to call them spiritual experiences. But in the 1980s and 90s, I know in Jewish life, they noticed that whenever they put spiritual into an upcoming program, they got a lot more people signing up for it. So they could do a program on the spirituality of dance, the spirituality of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the spirituality of 15th century Hungarian poetry, and they would double, triple the attendance that they would get if they didn't include the word spiritual. Any thoughts on any of that, Richard?
Well, I think I go back to that quote I read from the Big Book, that underneath it all, we all have this idea that there is something, that there is a higher power, that there's something greater than ourselves, that there's a reality that's bigger than what we observe. I kind of like Hamlet's little quip to his buddy Horatio. There is more in heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. And I like that quote. When I look at, and you and I really agree about this notion about the critiques that spirituality, people who are spiritual, have of religious people, and the critique that religious people have of spiritual people. I would say that they should be listening to each other and learning from each other and growing. That's what I think should be happening. Of course, it's not, but that's what should be happening. That's really kind of the intent, and I'm going to want to kind of close with something that James says about this. But before I do, I want to kind of address this, that my experience in 12 step, and I know I've shared this with you before, but it's part of a lifestyle of heading in a particular direction, the direction that is outlined by the steps and the traditions. In other words, when it comes to the moment of decision, which direction am I going to go into? Am I going to tell the truth, or am I going to lie? Truth. Am I going to yell at this person, or am I going to talk to this person? Well, I'm going to talk to this person. You learn to do that. The difficulty, and I'll give a really simple example to start with. Last week, my wife and I reorganized our kitchen. It was 2 weeks ago, actually. And, we put some things in different places. Now, my kitchen is very organized. And I like it that way because I like to know exactly where things are. But I just noticed a funny thing. I put the coffee cups and drink cups by where the coffee maker is and right by the sink. They used to be somewhere else. Now, for about a week, I was like always going right to that cabinet. But in the last 3 days, because I've been kind of doing things, I've been thinking about other things, distracted, I went to the old cabinet without thinking. And to me, that's a very simple example, but I think it has a lot to do with why this work takes work, why spirituality takes work, because the way the brain is constructed, it forms neural networks, and in those networks, it draws from different parts of the brain and different experiences, all to create a heuristic by which you will behave in a certain way. And it's a very complex process. I'm not even going to try to get into that. If you're interested in that, Robert Sapolsky has a series of lectures called The Biology of Behavior, and he starts from a single neuron all the way up to very complex drug interactions and behavior, as to how that works and what causes that to happen. And that really should give one a healthy respect for the nature of human behavior, what governs it, and what it takes to change it. In the Sermon on the Mount, there's this one section where Jesus actually reviews the five parallels of the Ten Commandments. That says, "You've heard that it was said." If you really unpack those, you'll see that in each case he's referring to one of those commandments. The first set would be, you have no other gods before me, and you shall not commit murder. The sense of that is the image of God is sacred, whether it's in a human being or whether it's toward God, and then that the respect for that is paramount. That's really what he's getting at. So when he says, "You've heard that it was said, you shall not murder," but I tell you, if you're angry with your brother, and then he goes through anger and contempt and all the things that come with that. The essence of his teaching isn't that you don't behave in a certain way. The essence of his teaching is that you need to become the kind of person who won't do those things. And he was speaking into a religious culture which said, we behave this way. The Pharisees could look and point to everything they ever did during any day and say, well, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, I didn't do this, I did all this, I did all that, I did all this. You know, I followed 116 rules, 266 rules, or whatever the number is, 616 rules, or whatever that number is. You probably know that better than I do. But I've done all those things, but it didn't change you on the inside. And that's the point. That change on the inside requires something that we see in step 6 and 7. You do this inventory of who you are. You take that long step back look at, oh, these are all the things, and I'm angry about this, and this is what happened. You start to look at that. You start to look at it from the standpoint of what was actually going on, and that you actually have a part in it. You know, the fact that, you know, someone is yelling you in your face, you know, you think, well, why are they yelling at you? Well, maybe because last week, you know, you did something to them that really pissed them off, and but you did that because you were selfish and because that's what you thought you wanted. But when they retaliate, you go, well, that's not fair. But, you know, in 12 step, we learn to take responsibility for our part in that whole affair. And my experience of doing that 4-step inventory with somebody, if you're going to be thorough about it, it takes some time. You're not talking weeks. You're talking months, maybe more. It took me 1.5 years personally, and I've seen that with other people. It just plain old takes time. And you have to be willing to hang in with that process. Most people are not willing to do that. That's what we were talking about. People just want to, you know, hey, I want to buy it off the shelf and get it and have it. This is, you know, character being what in Yiddish they say a mensch, a real person. You got to get a PhD in humanity, and you got to pay the dues. You've got to do that work. There's no shortcuts to that. Now, the benefit of spiritual experiences is, and I'll just relate it to me personally. The anchor for my willingness to do that has to do with the feeling I have about those experiences that I had. That tells me that God is actually real, that God is actually trustworthy, and my experience over time, anchored in that, but also supported by, you know, decades of ongoing experience that reinforce that, even in the face of opposition, and even in the face of, you know, my own skepticism and my own questions and my own doubts, which I'm always willing to entertain. But I think that this idea of what is the point of being spiritual if it doesn't give you better relationships and better life? What's the point? Isn't that the point? So isn't the point of doing the spiritual work to become the kind of person who will have good relationships? Isn't that the point of it all? And if that isn't the point, then what is the point? Because we're all here together, and guess what? Maybe the world would be a great place if it wasn't for all these people, but that's not the way it's going to be. We're always going to have to deal with people, and anything we want to do is going to include other people in a variety of ways. And the more adept we are at relationships that are fulfilling to ourselves and to the people around us, the better quality of life we're going to have overall. And that doesn't preclude some of the things that James was talking about, these horror of terrible things happening, which do. But his argument, and I would agree with him on this, is that, you know, a lifestyle, a spiritual lifestyle, which requires both a spiritual understanding and experience and a level of discipline to make certain choices about how you're going to live. Like for me, you know, I keep track of my finances. I record my numbers. There's just things that I do as a matter of course, as a matter of discipline, because I know that those will produce the kind of things in my life that I want. And you know, you can't pray your way out of something you behaved your way into. And that's what a lot of the people who, you know, want this spiritual magical wand, they want to go, oh God, please get me out of this, and they're out of that. It doesn't work that way. I mean, some things once in a while maybe do, but most of the time, if you have a pattern of behavior, that pattern of behavior has to change before your experience will change. That's what I really, really believe.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Richard. I understand that you need to move on, so I might just solo stream for a little while. So good to talk to you today.
I'd just like to kind of wrap it up with a couple of points.
Okay.
From James, which I think is a good place to leave it. And he asks in his conclusions, ought it be assumed that in all men, the mixture of religion with other elements should be identical? Ought it indeed be assumed that the lives of all men should show identical religious elements? In other words, is the existence of so many religious types and sects and creeds regrettable? To these questions, I answer no, emphatically. And my reason is that I do not see how it is possible that creatures in such different positions with such different powers as human individuals have exactly the same functions and same duties. No two of us have identical difficulties, nor should we be expected to work out identical solutions. Each from his particular angle of observation takes in a certain sphere of fact and trouble, which each must deal with in a unique manner. One of us must soften himself, another must harden himself. One must yield the point, another must stand firm. In order the better to defend the position assigned to him. If Emerson were forced to be a Wesley or a Moody forced to be a Whitman, the total human consciousness of the divine would suffer. The divine can mean no single quality. It must mean a group of qualities, by being champions of which in alternation, different men may all find worthy missions. And this is the part I really love. Each attitude being a syllable in human nature's total message. It takes the whole of us to spell out the meaning completely. And for me, that's a call for something in this time. James found himself in the middle of the social revolution, which rejected the dark and pessimistic aspects of the established Christian faith and in scientific minds of religion in general. And while the face of this rejection is optimism and idealism and the belief that just given the chance, man can create a perfect society, it must be observed that James did not experience the two world wars and many other atrocities presented by the 20th century. I think James would argue that the notion of human perfectibility plays into many human psychological biases, which also inhibit thorough self-awareness. And not only self-awareness, but a deeper appreciation of the diversity and complexity of the human experience. The last sentence I just read bears repeating. It takes the whole of us to spell out the meaning completely. The willingness to listen, collaborate, and cooperate inferred in this statement is of paramount importance in this time of humanity's history. We live in an epoch of multiplying ideas, theories, and opinions. Social echo chambers reinforce ideas and preferences without appropriate checks and balances. The kind of polarization this encourages inhibits healthy collaboration, which, given the present global scale of human endeavor and the associated risks, is more necessary than ever. So I think that James' message of deeper understanding of the whole of our experience, not just the preferred parts, is today essential to human flourishing. I kind of want to leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Richard. I'm going to solo stream for a little bit after this, but thanks for coming by and preparing your thoughts on the William James book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience. Thank you, sir.
Well, I hope it's helpful to someone.
Yeah, it's certainly helpful to me. I enjoyed the discussion.
Me too. Thanks so much, Luke.
Okay,
you have a great afternoon.
Take care, Richard. Bye-bye. Okay, so I have some thoughts here on this William James book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience. Let me go to the Wikipedia entry. So in his book Varieties, and today, if it was written today, it'd be called The Varieties of the Spiritual Experience, because there isn't much in Varieties of the Religious Experience that is explicitly about religion. It's rather about solo spirituality. So James explicitly excludes from this book both theology and religious institutions. He chooses to limit his study to direct and immediate personal religious experience. And a key distinction in his treatment of religion is that of healthy-minded religion and religion of the sick soul. So healthy-minded religion is a religion of life's goodness, while the religion of the sick soul cannot overcome the radical sense of evil in the world. Now, William James presents this as value neutral, so you'd think he's automatically saying that it is the healthy-minded religion, that's the good kind of religion. But no, he's not saying that. In fact, it becomes clear that he regards the sick-souled religious experience as preferable, and his anonymous source of melancholy experience in lectures 6 and 7 is in fact autobiographical. So he doesn't get explicitly first-person autobiographical in this book, but that's where the melancholy comes from. So William James considered healthy-mindedness to be America's main contribution to religion, which you saw running from the Transcendentalists Ralph Waldo Emerson to Walt Whitman to Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science. At the extreme, the healthy-minded see sickness and evil as an illusion. William James considered belief in the mind cure to be reasonable when compared to medicine as practiced at the beginning of the 20th century. So when William James went to Harvard, Harvard at that time had very few standards. If you could pay tuition, you got into Harvard. And to be a medical doctor up until about 1900, you only had to pass like 4 out of 9 tests. So it was incredibly shoddy. And until the 1930s, according to Greg Cochran, medicine and doctors killed far more people than they saved. So it's only about the 1930s that doctors started to do more benefit than harm. Now, this difference between healthy-minded religion and religion of the sick soul, this is very much like the difference between the right-wing and the left-wing instinctive approach to life. The traditional European right-wing approach to life was that it was a politics of the Christian doctrine of original sin. So right-wing politics has as its foundation its skeptical view of human nature. So all politics has as its foundation a particular view of human nature. So left-wing policy sees flourishing human potential and sees all the wonderful goodness inherent in the human soul. Right-wing politics tends to have a very skeptical view of human nature, whether it's the Christian doctrine of original sin or the Jewish doctrine of the two Yeatzes, the two urges. There's one to do good and one to do evil in every person. It's just a lot easier, generally speaking, to trend downwards towards evil. And so Judaism is a religion of thousands of laws. You don't have a religion of thousands of laws if you believe human nature is basically good. So right-wing politics starts with extreme skepticism of human nature. Left-wing policy begins with an optimistic view of human nature. And so the healthy-minded religion in the perspective of William James is a religion of life's goodness. And that's kind of the left-wing approach to life. It's an approach that bases itself on an optimistic view of human nature. Now, sick-minded religion, according to William James, cannot overcome the radical sense of evil in the world, and that's the right-wing approach. We are keenly aware of the potential of human beings to do evil. So people who are very strong in the personality trait of conscientiousness, they will overwhelmingly tend to be right-wing. So conscientious people, they like to organize their time, they like to organize their money, they like to organize their home. So if you simply walk into a room, if it's a mess, the odds are that the person will be left-wing. If you walk into a home and everything's neat and organized, the odds are that the person will be right-wing. So from the right-wing perspective, one's attitude to life is that the world is chaotic, dangerous, filled with evil, filled with people who can go off and wreak enormous harm to you. And so you're very selective about who you let into your home. You're very selective about who you let into your life. And the right-wing approach is to continually going back to order, continually trying to clean things up, keep things organized. We want order in society. We know that the traditional ways work. So that's the traditional right-wing approach to life. And this is a right-left distinction that you can use going back thousands and thousands of years. The modern right-left distinction goes back to the French Parliament at the end of the 18th century. But this more traditional understanding of right-left-wing differences, basically your attitudes towards change. Left-wing approach to life is that change is frequently wonderful. The right-wing approach to life is heavy skepticism of change. The right-wing approach to life is to continually try to keep things ordered. And the left-wing approach to life is, let's try something new. Let's not be afraid to experiment. That which is different may be wonderful. The right-wing approach is that which is different is scary and potentially dangerous. And the left-wing approach to difference is, this could be wonderful, this could be exciting, this could be a great thing. So William James believed that religious experiences can have morbid origins, so he's probably speaking very much for himself as well. When you are chronically depressed, as William James was, then that's going to color or your perspectives on life. Unlike the bad ideas that people have under the influence of a high fever after a religious experience, the ideas and insights usually remain and are often valued for the rest of the person's life. So William James had relatively little interest in the legitimacy or illegitimacy of religious experience, and he had virtually no interest in actually practicing religion himself. Same with Carl Jung, and same with Bill Wilson, the founder of AA. So even though William James's examples in this book are almost exclusively drawn from Christianity, he does not limit his ideas to any single religion. So though William James intended to approach this topic of religious experience from a pragmatic angle, Richard Rorty, the American philosopher, argues that William James ultimately deviated from this methodology. In his lectures on saintliness, the intention is to discover whether the saintly virtues are beneficial for human life. If they are, then according to William James's pragmatism, that supports their claim to truth. However, William James ends up concluding that the value of the saintly virtues is dependent on their origin, given that the saintly virtues are only beneficial if there is an afterlife for which they can prepare us. Their value depends on whether they are divinely ordained or the result of human psychology. So this is no longer a question of value, but of empirical fact. So James ends up abandoning his own pragmatist philosophy due to his ultimate reliance on empirical evidence. William James talks about over-beliefs, beliefs which are not strictly justified by reason, but which might be held by smart people nonetheless. Philosophy can shape these over-beliefs. William James finds wanting the traditional arguments for the existence of God, including the cosmological argument that the universe argues for God's existence. So, infer God's existence from how the universe works, matters of causation, explanation, change, motion, contingency, dependency, finitude, all arguments for God. The argument of design, or the teleological argument, the argument from design, that a design implies a designer, that if you're walking in the desert and you found a computer, you would expect that some higher intelligence had created that computer and left it there. And William James also rejected the argument from morality, that there is no objective right and wrong unless you can reference a transcendent source of morality. And William James also rejected the argument from popular consensus. So William James admits to having his own overbelief, so a belief which is not justified by reason, which he does not intend to prove, but he believes that there is a greater reality than what is normally accessible by our senses. Time magazine discussed this book, William James, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, in 1963, making little allowance for the fact that people can also be converted to vicious creeds. William James acquired admirers he would have deplored. Mussolini, for instance, hailed William James as a preceptor who had shown him that an action should be judged by its results rather than its doctrinary basis. James had no intention of giving comfort to latter-day totalitarians. He was simply impatient with his fellow academicians and their endless hair-splitting over matters that had no relation to life. A vibrant, generous person, he hoped to show that religious emotions, even those of the deranged, were crucial to human life. The great virtue of the varieties, noted pragmatist philosopher Charles Peirce, is its penetration into the hearts of people. Its great weakness, retorted George Santayana, is its tendency to disintegrate the idea of truth, to recommend belief without reason, and to encourage superstitions. 1986, Nicholas Lash, an English Roman Catholic theologian, challenged William James' separation of the personal and the institutional. Lash argued that religious geniuses such as St. Paul and Jesus did not have their religious experiences in isolation, but within and influenced by a social and historical and institutional context. So Lash argues that this comes from William James' failure to overcome Cartesian dualism in his thought. While James believed he had succeeded in surpassing Descartes, he was still tied to a notion of an internal ego, distinct from the body or outside world, which undergoes experiences. All right, I was talking about Ernest Gellner earlier, so let me play a little bit here of Ernest Gellner speaking in a seminar.
Now to Ernest Gellner's comments.
1977.
Well, I take it I'm meant to be brief. I shall endeavour to be. The country's figure falls into two parts. And I think the second one I can comment on very briefly, not being attached to. I think I'll concentrate on the early general observations about approaches to social change. I don't think I disagree with Dr. Humphrey very substantially. It's really a matter of nuance and stress. Now, perhaps one could begin by, and she didn't use the word not, she used tangle, I think, with the word used to describe the condition and brought itself into through functionalism. Now, my view of the situation is much less pessimistic than this. I prefer to use the word not, which I think is reasonably called it tangle. And I don't think, believe it or not, I think functionalism was decided to be extremely useful, continues to be so, and there's no very serious problem about it, for the following reasons. Now, I was surprised to see Dr. Humphreys describe evolutionism as an answer to a what question. Now, it struck me always as very, very, very conspicuously an answer to a how question. What is true about evolutionism, that the what and the how are somewhat muddled. The essence of evolutionism, what I mean by evolutionism, is to concentrate on the line of development as the answer to the question, why is a society or our society or any society the way it is? And the answer then is to trace a line, to trace a genealogy. Right? One way of looking at it, of course, is a survival of genealogical thinking. You explain the position and status of anything by tracing its ancestry and the way it's anchored to its point of origin. This is one aspect of it. But the reason why this is a great appeal, because at the same time, it seems to be explanatory. The how and the what were conflated. I suppose the model for many evolutionists, of course, was Darwinism. And I suppose the appeal of Darwinism was precisely that a mechanism of change, natural selection, was conflated with a hypothetical story about how we got there. And the hypothetical story about how we got there was the replacement of an alternative story. We got there because we were put there in the first place and it stayed that way. So it was an answer to a stability hypothesis. But the two things got conflated. And the reason, what gave it an appeal, that it seemed to be explanatory, that it wasn't just... Now, the reason why it seemed explanatory is because stability was taken to be self-explanatory, which is a dreadful mistake. Had we been put there by God or from the start, had species or societies been put there at the beginning by an extraneous force, it would assume that consequently there's no mystery.
Okay, so there are quite a few videos on YouTube if you want to hear more about Ernest Gellner. Here's a lecture on William James, his life and philosophy.
And neither of them are wrong. To James, it's all correct. But they're each feeling a different part of the human experience and the different part of the stream of consciousness, and they're trying to decide, what part is right? What part works for me? And again, we tend to dislike this, and James was attacked resolutely then, and people are attacked resolutely now for this, because they say, well, how do you have any ethics or morals? How do you have any sense of right or wrong? And James says, well, it's tricky. And so he wrote sort of a big book in pursuit of these questions called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which, if you want to think about it, if 1,100 pages of the principles of psychology wasn't enough for you, it's really the third 800-page volume, which makes it a roundish 2,000-page read. Highly recommended, but you want to set aside some time. And what the varieties of religious experience, as far as I know, again, no other work I've ever seen even approaches this. But James says, look, here's the thing. Empiricists, scientists, whatever you want to call them, sit down and say, well, there's no evidence that God exists, so there's no God. And James is like, well, but people have all these experiences that they say are very religious. They're not lying. They're serious. So we either have to treat them as mentally deranged, or we can take them seriously and ask, what is the nature of their experiences? That's pragmatism. It's not right or wrong. It's what is it? Let's understand it. Let's think about it. And so he has an 800-ish page long book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. When he goes through he is just encyclopedic. Says, Christian mystics, Buddhists, Hindus, the scholastic tradition, the meditative tradition, hallucination with drugs, isolation, wandering just every possible reporting. He uses historical reports, he does his experiments, he uses literature, he uses religious texts from all over the world, saints, monks, prophets, you name it. It's got it. It's sort of magisterial in the scope that he explores. And his conclusion from this is that, one, people really do have religious experiences. Two, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a God. Right? And that's the problem, because you can't prove anything from the isolated experience of an individual. Because back to the principles of psychology, our thoughts and our experiences are our own. If you get a bunch of people who share thoughts and experiences, what you have is accumulation of isolated experiences. And they're probably not all that comparable anyway, which is one of the things as you go through the varieties of religious experience that he explores. Sometimes things that seem very similar are very different. They've been lumped together in tradition, but not exactly the same. And so he throws us into this world where he's like, yeah, look, what you want is evidence. You want facts. You want to act in the world based on that, because if you don't, you suffer, more or less. That's your problem. You're in the world. If you have bad, wrong-headed ideas, you usually suffer for them. That causes us to modify our thinking. And then we try and come up with a new model, with a new philosophy that we can apply more effectively. And then, in that sense, it becomes more true because it allows us to act more and reduces that strain. But again, all of this built on a model of the mind as being plastic, subject to our own revision, and not really terribly well connected with the world. And so back to this notion of truth, because science says, what do we know that's absolutely true? Look, anywhere in the universe, if you have a circle, right, you're going to come up with pi, because you can't square the circle. So this is what mathematicians will say. This. Look, that's just true. It's true everywhere. Now, you don't have to argue against that. You can just say, well, that's fine. But notice that some society like we do might just round off after one place. They might just say, pi is 3. And then we would say, no, it's 3.1. They're like, we don't do that. Perfectly reasonable thing to do. Because it's easy to imagine someone doing that. It would limit the accuracy of your calculation of pi, but you don't do that very much. Right? And so this notion that this is some universal truth, no, it seems to us like it must be a universal truth because that's the answer we're going to get every time. And we can't figure out how somebody else would get a different answer. Well, they won't if they do what we do, which is if they're just like us, they'll be just like us. Or they might have some society that comes up with 3.14, whatever it is, and then says, okay, but we don't count mathematical things as true. We only count things that you can taste as true. Right? If you can't taste it, We'll just bracket it off as potentially true, but not really true. Apples, they're true. Pie, no taste, it doesn't count. By the way, this is what people used to think, not taste, but if you couldn't experience it, nobody believed in it. Right? We always think of, all those superstitious people living in the primitive tribe. It's the other way around. They only believed in things that they could experience directly. We're the superstitious ones because we believe in all kinds of abstract crap we've never seen, touched, felt, or know really anything directly about. Back to the variety of religious experience. And James points this out. He says, look, your primitive tribe people, no, they have these experiences. They feel it. That's why they believe in it. He says, he really hated whether theists. People with theists are sort of Christian idea that God created the world and then left. And he's like, oh, come on. So we can't even, so we have to believe in God, but we can't experience him because he's gone. He's like, oh, that's the dumbest idea ever. So you don't want to discount God, but you don't want to have any encounter with him. Right? You don't want to ever feel him. He says if you ever have the opportunity to feel him, you're like totally rejecting the basis on which to believe anything anyway. And theism is really popular today. Theism is still relatively popular. He's like, look, believe in anything but theism. That's the one thing he really sort of drew the line. Like, theism is dumb. But there's no, God created the world and left, so we don't know anything about him. Yeah, he's not much use for theism. So not surprised, as you can imagine, someone who comes up with these arguments is accused of all kinds of things, sort of like relativism, right? Well, if so in my tribe, it's perfectly normal to kill all the women when they're 25 just because we like to do that, then it's fine. And James is like, no. I mean, it's true that they do this, right? It's also true that they think it's fine. That doesn't mean you have to think it's fine, because your experience and your philosophical ideas tell you, well, that's a bad thing to do to women. They ought not do that. And so we'll take steps, perhaps, to stop them from doing that. And hearts and minds, right? We'll try and re-educate them, literally, hearts and minds. Because if we can get them in the habit of not doing that, it will never even occur to them to do it anymore. Right? One had a son, had a daughter, so, well, we'll just kill the daughter. Right? Makes perfect sense to me. When did we stop doing that? We used to do it. Every culture did, pretty much. And so, at some point, we got out of the habit of it. And now we think, ooh, that's terrible that those people do it. James says, look, it's okay to say that it's terrible, but you can't say that they shouldn't do it from any universal principle. There is no universal principle. The universal principle is because we feel like they shouldn't do it. That's what you have to appeal to. Our experience, our philosophy, our habituation leads us to think what you're doing is stupid and what we're doing is smart. And he says, what we want to claim is that we're in the right. We're standing on the grounds of absolute certitude and truth. You are a backwards, reprobate culture, and you must be corrected. It's like, yeah, no, you can't stand on those grounds. The only ground you can stand on is your sense that that is wrong. That's the only ground. You have no further claim. And James allows no further claim than that. He suggests strongly that you think about things, that you try to examine the evidence as best you can. But he does point out in several letters in particular that people fall into habits. This is one of the dangers of habits, is they're so powerful that it turns off basically our humanity because we don't have to think about things. We just become creatures of habit, at which point we're cows. I don't know why they always call people cows, but that's the bad one, right? When you become a stupid creature of habit, you're a cow. But that's what we become, right? We become these dumb creatures of habit. We're just cows. And he applies these theories all over the place, by the way. Last example, he talks, best article I've ever read on animal intelligence is by William James, called The Intelligence of Beasts, I think. Beast at that point only had the connotation of an animal. It didn't have a pejorative connotation. Now beast is bad, right? You wouldn't call somebody's dog, oh, that's a very cute beast you have there. But in James's time, we would say, oh, that's a very cute beast you have there. But he said, so we have dogs, right? And he says, and the thing with dogs is they're so smart that we can't figure out why they're so dumb. I love the way he posits that, because he says, if they were a little dumber all the time, we wouldn't expect them to be smart at all.
Okay, looking at Twitter right now, Polymath tweets, a month ago, Noah Smith, he's an opinion writer for Bloomberg, said the reason that San Francisco wasn't as bad as New York City with coronavirus cases was because San Francisco wasn't testing enough, give it time. Well, it's a month later, and San Francisco is still very, very few cases of coronavirus, very few fatalities, just no comparison between San Francisco and New York. Just as with the 1918 Spanish influenza, California and places like Australia got off quite light, while cities on the East Coast, such as New York and Philadelphia, were devastated. So just want to point out that Bloomberg opinion writer Noah Smith, he's not worth paying attention to. He's just continually wrong. Don't trust people like this. Remember the people who made all sorts of terrible predictions with regard to the coronavirus, and they may fill out their opinions with numbers and data that they don't understand. They make predictions, they influence opinions, but they don't care about the truth. People like Noah Smith fundamentally don't care about truth. They don't care about the people who listen to them or trust them. They're just bad people. When the moment finally comes where educating people and helping them to understand something dangerous and new is a vitally important task, people who should have been good at it messed up. They told you to hate people who were telling you the truth. Make sure you remember all the predictions from all the people who didn't have the slightest clue about what was going on but acted like they did. Remember all those viral tweets and lousy articles that carelessly spread lies. Put these people on a list, never trust them again. Okay, so I want to play a little bit more here from Ernest Gellner. This is a summary of his thoughts on nationalism.
What is a nation? For the past decades, nations were seen as a product of either will or shared culture. Ernest Gellner pointed out that both will and culture as criteria which define nations are too rich in differentiation. On the one hand, we have will, which is a crucial point for group formation. Nevertheless, because of a group having a common interest, it is not already a nation. Generally, groups are based on a mixture of loyalty and identification, but also positive or negative hopes and fears. On the other hand, the definition of nations in terms of shared culture brings in far too rich a catch as well. Cultural boundaries are sometimes sharp and sometimes fuzzy. Culture in general isn't bound to state borders. The establishment of high cultures made it seem that nationality may be definable in terms of shared culture. Nowadays, people can live only in units defined by shared culture, but especially in the past, culturally plural societies worked well. But with the rise of industrialization, the economy began to standardize products and also consumers. From the standardized school system to the monotone assembly line work, it became more convenient to sort of standardize people's minds as well. From standardization, also a general feeling of an old, shared culture developed. It seemed only natural to form nation-states based on the new, old culture going hand in hand with invented traditions, holidays, and so on. Gellner's point is that because of this, nations can be rather defined in terms of the age of nationalism, which went parallel to the industrialization than the other way around. So the fusion of will, culture, and polity becomes the norm for defining a nation. Polity is seen here as a convergence of both will and culture. In these conditions, men will to be politically united with all those and only those who share their culture. As already mentioned, we can also see a connection between nationalism and invented traditions, as nationalism uses pre-existing cultures and cultural wealth, though it uses them very selectively and often transforms them in a radical way. Dead languages can be revived and traditions invented. Nationalism is often not what it seems. The cultures it claims to defend and revive are often its own inventions.
Okay, we're going to learn a lot more about Ernest Gellner in the weeks ahead. I was emailing with an academic today about this problem of the administrative state versus democracy that we discussed earlier today, and who deals with this more effectively than the United States. So my academic friend said possibly the Swiss. There's an older book by Carl Friedrich that I need to look at, but it contrasts the Swiss with the German model. Switzerland is a restrictive state, but transparent and democratic federal structure probably helps. Scandinavia is generally the least democratic part of Europe in this regard. In Sweden, it is even against the law for elected officials to interfere with bureaucrats. Okay, Ernest Gellner here on nationalism.
Today. And I'm going to come up with a very mixed answer. In some ways, no. I take seriously a comment once of David Layton, the American theorist of nationalism, who said, Ernest describes his life and calls it sociology. There's something to the idea that he's writing a theory produced through the circumstances of somebody of Central European, Jewish background, 20th century Europe, which some of those circumstances may have changed, but not completely. So I'll produce an answer which goes a little bit both ways, because I think that's the way the things ought to be. Let me remind us, or tell some of you perhaps, certain things about his life. Not in order to give a biography, but in order to reflect upon some of those circumstances. And the important thing is that, of course, he came from a highly diverse world. At the end of the 19th century, it's important to know that a formerly dominant minority, the Germans of Prague, were slowly overtaken by the Czechs from the countryside who moved in with industrialization, very much second to last of those two placards. But the position of people with a Jewish background in this world was extremely complicated. The Czechs wanted to diminish the size of the German-speaking population, so put enormous pressure upon the Jews to go to Czech schools, try to close down their schools. In this world, the Jews were in terrible ambivalences. They obeyed that. Some of them wanted to get in, but the Czechs would never really let them in fully. They would always recognize that they were Jewish. This is Kafka's world, a world of three cultures in which there were all sorts of options, and people moved from one option to another several times in their life. Kafka's very typical High German culture, chasing young Czech girls, wanting very desperately at times to become a Zionist. None of these things completely, fundamentally homeless. That's the world from which Gellner's family came. But he himself was born in Paris, but grew up in Prague in the 1920s, when things were slightly different. He had the variety. His father had strong communist links in his youth. His aunt ran the Zionist organization inside Prague before eventually going to Israel.
Okay, there are a lot more videos of Ernest Gellner, about Ernest Gellner on YouTube, in addition to his many books, which are widely available. He died in 1995. He was a scholar of nationalism, among other topics. That's it for me for